You knew I forbid you to read that trash. Now tell me where you got it.
It isn't trash.
Together we stand, as a beacon of hope against the gathering storm.
Her breath is fading.
We are losing her.
Imagine a woman living in the 19th century with no formal education, no theological training, no social influence, and no supportive husband. Imagine a woman who spent her early life surrounded by poverty, loss, and humiliation. Now, imagine that same woman standing before crowds of 25,000 people, and without touching anyone, hundreds suddenly collapsing to the ground as if struck by an invisible force. Some would remain motionless for hours, others for days. A few even claimed they remained in a trance for up to 8 days, later describing visions of heaven and hell so vivid that entire towns began talking about it. Doctors came to investigate, skeptics came to expose fraud, journalists filled their notebooks trying to explain what was happening, yet many left without answers. Welcome to the channel Maria Woodworth Etter, The Untold Revival. Today we are diving into one of the most mysterious and powerful stories in the history of Christian revival. Her name was Maria Woodworth Etter, and what happened during her meetings shocked the United States in a way few revivals ever had. Newspapers across the country, including the New York Times, documented crowds collapsing, sinners crying out for mercy, and entire communities transformed after her meetings. But what makes this story even more extraordinary is where she came from. Maria did not begin life as a famous preacher. She began as a poor farmer's daughter struggling simply to survive. She buried 5 of her 6 children. Her own husband mocked her faith and resisted her calling. She often wrote in her diary that she cried herself to sleep because she lacked education. Yet somehow, this broken woman became one of the most powerful evangelists America had ever seen. What do you think God can do with someone who feels unqualified? Have you ever felt like your past disqualifies you from your purpose? As you listen to this story, ask yourself a question. What if God chooses the most unlikely people to carry the greatest callings? Maria Beulah Woodworth was born on July 22, 1844, in a small town called New Lisbon in the state of Ohio in the United States. Life was not easy in that household. Her father, Samuel Underwood, struggled with alcohol and often spent the family's money on drinking, leaving Maria's mother to somehow feed 8 children with almost nothing. Poverty shaped Maria's childhood in ways she would never forget. When she was still young, hunger and hardship were daily realities. Yet everything changed when Maria was 11 years old. Her parents experienced a spiritual awakening and converted to Christianity. For the first time, hope entered their home. But only a year later, tragedy struck. While working in the fields during a harvest, Maria's father died from heat stroke. Suddenly, the fragile stability the family had begun to build collapsed again. Maria's mother was left alone with 8 children and almost no resources. At an age when most children were still playing, Maria had to begin working to help support the household. 2 years later, at 13 years old, Maria attended a meeting at the Church of the Disciples of Christ. During the sermon about the cross of Jesus, something happened inside her that she could never forget. She later wrote that her heart overflowed with the love of Christ and that her eyes became fountains of tears. She was the first person to walk to the altar that night. The next day, she was baptized. But along with salvation came something else, a deep inner conviction that God was calling her to preach the gospel. And that calling terrified her. Why? Because in that era, women were rarely accepted as preachers. Maria had no education and feared ridicule. She wrote in her diary that she often cried herself to sleep because she felt incapable of doing what God seemed to ask of her. Have you ever felt that tension between what you believe God is asking and what you think you are capable of doing? In 1863, when Maria was 19 years old, she married a man named Philo Horace Woodworth. At first, she hoped marriage would bring stability and companionship. Instead, it brought another layer of struggle. Philo had little interest in spiritual matters and openly opposed Maria's desire to preach. His focus was the farm in Ohio, and he expected Maria to devote herself entirely to domestic life. But the pain did not stop there. Over the years, Maria gave birth to 6 children. 5 of them died while still young. Try to imagine that level of grief. 1 child buried might break a parent's heart. Maria buried 5. At the same time, she endured a marriage filled with tension, betrayal, and emotional suffering. Many people would have abandoned faith altogether under such circumstances, and no one would have blamed her. Yet Maria continued praying. She continued believing that God had spoken to her heart years earlier. During that time, she began experiencing vivid dreams and visions. She wrote that angels sometimes appeared to her during the night and carried her in visions over fields, rivers, forests, and towns. In one recurring dream, she saw vast fields of ripe wheat stretching beyond the horizon. As she began preaching in the dream, the wheat fell like a harvest ready to be gathered. Slowly, she began to understand the symbolism. The fields represented people. The harvest represented souls. God, she believed, was showing her that she would one day gather a spiritual harvest. Finally, in 1880, at 35 years old, Maria made a decision that would change her life forever. Despite the opposition, despite the fear, and despite her lack of education, she began preaching publicly. What do you think it takes for someone to step into their calling after years of doubt and suffering? Could it be that sometimes the deepest pain prepares us for the greatest purpose? Almost immediately, something unusual began happening in Maria's meetings. People were not simply moved emotionally by the sermons. Many suddenly collapsed to the ground without anyone touching them. Witnesses described entire groups losing physical strength and falling as if overcome by a powerful presence. Doctors, lawyers, farmers, skeptics, and children experienced the same phenomenon. And it did not last only a few moments. Some remained in a trance-like state for hours or even days. Historical reports describe individuals lying still for as long as 8 days without eating or drinking, later awakening to describe visions of heaven, hell, angels, or scenes of judgment. The events spread quickly through the region. Curiosity grew. Crowds multiplied. In the first 18 months of ministry alone, Maria preached 200 sermons, conducted 9 major evangelistic campaigns, planted 2 churches, and spoke in 22 different congregations. Her momentum seemed unstoppable. In Alexandria, Indiana, one of her meetings drew a crowd of 25,000 people gathered outdoors because the tent she used could only hold 8,000. According to her own testimony, before she finished speaking, the power of God swept through the crowd and more than 500 people fell under the spiritual influence. Some raised their hands toward heaven, others cried out in repentance. Many began praising God spontaneously. Maria herself said the experience overwhelmed her so deeply that assistants had to carry her back to her tent. In another event, in Kokomo, Indiana, 12,000 people gathered near the Wildcat Creek River to watch 82 people baptized. Within weeks, 62 more were baptized, and a church of 320 members was established. Newspapers across the country reported these events. When the New York Times and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch began publishing front-page stories about the meetings, the entire nation took notice. But whenever something extraordinary happens in ministry, opposition usually follows, and Maria's story was no exception.
One of Maria's most vocal critics was a controversial preacher named John Alexander Dowie. Although he also claimed to practice divine healing, Dowie strongly opposed Maria's meetings. Instead of supporting her ministry, he traveled across the country preaching against her, sometimes even canceling his own healing services just to speak publicly against her influence. Yet Maria responded in a surprising way. She declared that Dowie's ministry would eventually collapse, and that she would still be alive when his downfall came. Years later, that prophecy seemed to unfold. Dowie proclaimed himself an apostle and built a religious community called Zion near Chicago. Over time, his behavior became increasingly extreme, and newspapers described him as standing on the border of insanity. Followers began abandoning him, and in 1907 he died in isolation and regret. Meanwhile, Maria continued preaching. In 1913, she faced another major challenge when authorities in Massachusetts arrested her on accusations of obtaining money under false pretenses because people gave offerings during healing meetings. After a 4-day trial, she was completely acquitted of every charge. She continued preaching for years afterward. Finally, in 1924, at 80 years old, Maria Woodworth Etter died in Indianapolis, with her mind still clear and her faith still strong. Over 45 years of ministry, she led more than 116 documented revivals, preached to crowds reaching 25,000 people, planted 12 churches, constructed 6 church buildings, and helped raise 12 new licensed ministers. She conducted Pentecostal-style meetings 13 years before the famous Azusa Street revival. Because of this influence, many historians call her the grandmother of Pentecostalism. And yet, after her death, much of her written legacy disappeared and was forgotten for decades, until a descendant rediscovered her sermons in 1977. Her story leaves us with a powerful reminder. God does not search for the most qualified people. He qualifies